As a fairly young man, and without a real job, I have a very little amount of incoming money. This means I have to be responsible with the money I do have. I have to consider what's important and realize what I can and can't afford to spend. It's called budgeting. And do you know why we refer to it as a budget? It's because when you have this amount of money, you can't budget. That's all you got. There isn't any more. But that's why we budget. It's a necessary task that requires sacrifice. But it's not always that hard. For instance, just recently I had the option to go out and eat at a nice restaurant, followed by bowling with some friends. The price tag for this would have been about $20, which isn't terrible, but it's a lot of money when you're not making any. Now I'm fortunate enough to still live at home, so I decided to eat some of Mom's home cooking before going bowling. Out of the $20 I had, I saved $10 on the meal and spent $10 on bowling. I would have loved to have eaten out as well, but I had to cut something, so I did. Now, why do I tell you all about this? Well, partly because I think my life is just so cool, y'all need to hear about it. But on a side note, I want to use this illustration and make an application on our government. As a fairly young government, much of which doesn't have a real job, it has a very large amount of debt. This means it needs to be responsible with the money it does get. It needs to consider what's important and what it can and can't afford to spend. It's called budgeting. It's a necessary task that requires sacrifice. But it's not always that hard. For instance, the government funds over $350 million to Planned Parenthood every year. Now, that's not a terrible price tag when you weigh it against the billions of dollars the government spends, but it's still a lot of money, especially when you're not making any. Of course, the government is making money. Literally, they're printing money and they're also taking money from us. That's right. Who's got to come up with the $350 million? You and me, the taxpayers. Now, I'm not against taxes. That's how we run our government. But even with our current tax system, which is rather high, we still have to cut something. So why not let it be our precious Planned Parenthood? This video is not to say whether or not abortion is wrong. Abortion is wrong. And it's not whether or not to say Planned Parenthood should cease to exist. Planned Parenthood should cease to exist. This video is just to bring into question why all of us tax-paying citizens are having to pay for Planned Parenthood's operations and the consequential millions of abortions that are happening there. Frankly, if you're going to have an abortion, you shouldn't, then pay for it yourself. Why is the United States being held financially responsible for it when we can't afford it and half of us don't want it? Now you may argue that the taxpayers' money that's being funded to a Planned Parenthood is not allocated for abortions, just for whatever else they do. Okay, but let me ask you this. If you give me $500 and say, don't spend it on video games, and then I buy food and clothing with it, but then I take $500 I had planned for food and clothing and buy video games with it, did you not give me the resources I needed to buy video games? However you want to slice it, the taxpayer money is giving Planned Parenthood the resources they need to fund abortions. Planned Parenthood is currently being funded because it is considered a healthcare provider. Really? Planned Parenthood is about health? That's like going to a funeral home to rejuvenate yourself. If Planned Parenthood is about health, then how come one of its main businesses is death? If Planned Parenthood is about care, then how come it is repeatedly being found as covering up sexual abuse, rape, and trafficking? If Planned Parenthood is about, parenthood, then how come its own website lists ways that you can exclude your parents from even knowing about your abortion? Since Planned Parenthood is obviously not a legitimate healthcare provider, then why are we still funding it? And since we obviously can't afford it, then why are we still funding it? Here's the bottom line. We need to cut federal funding from Planned Parenthood. And it's not going to be an easy task. So, the question is, what are you going to do about it?